This might sound like something invented for a dark fantasy story, but for centuries across Europe, animals were arrested, judged, and executed as if they were human beings. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbolic act, but inside real courtrooms, with real judges, real witnesses, and real sentences being carried out. Imagine walking into a courtroom and seeing not a person standing accused, but a pig, confined, observed, waiting for judgment. And no one in that room questioning whether it made sense, because to them, it did. Now pause for a second and really think about that. Not one isolated case, not one moment of collective madness. This happened again and again, across different regions, across different centuries. Pigs, horses, dogs, even insects, all of them at some point stood accused under human law. And the most disturbing part isn't just that it happened, it's that the people involved truly believed they were delivering justice. To understand how a society could reach this point, you have to leave behind everything you know about modern logic. You have to step into a world where science doesn't explain tragedy, where randomness isn't accepted, and where every event, especially the horrifying ones, demands meaning. The medieval world wasn't irrational in the way we often imagine. It was structured, it was ordered, but that order was built on belief, not evidence. On the idea that everything that happened had intention behind it. And if there is intention, there must be responsibility. There was no room for accidents without purpose, no space for saying, "This just happened," because that kind of thinking creates something far more dangerous than any crime: uncertainty. And uncertainty destroys the sense of control people rely on to feel safe. So when something went wrong, someone or something had to be held accountable. And that's where animals enter the story. In medieval Europe, animals weren't distant from human life the way they are today. They weren't confined to farms or controlled environments. They lived among people. They walked the same streets, ate from the same spaces, existed as part of the daily rhythm of life. A pig wasn't just livestock, it was a presence, constant, familiar, unpredictable. And sometimes dangerous. In small villages, pigs roamed freely. They scavenged for food, moved through narrow streets, interacted with everything around them. And while most of the time this coexistence worked, there were moments when it didn't. Moments when something shifted and the line between harmless animal and real threat disappeared instantly. There are documented cases, real records, of pigs attacking children, not out of malice, not out of calculated intent, but out of instinct, hunger, opportunity. And when those moments happened, they were brutal, sudden, impossible to rationalize in a way that felt acceptable. So instead of accepting instinct, people chose intention. One of the most infamous cases comes from a French village where a pig was accused of killing a child. The event itself was horrifying enough, but what followed is what transformed it into something almost unbelievable. The animal wasn't simply killed or removed. It was arrested, confined, held in custody. Think about that. A prison for an animal. Time passing, days, weeks, as if the pig could reflect on what it had done. And then the trial. Inside that courtroom, everything followed the structure of a human legal proceeding. Judges presided over the case. Witnesses came forward. Testimonies were given in detail. People described what they had seen, what they believed had happened, and most importantly, what it meant. Because that's what they were really trying to determine. Meaning, the pig wasn't just being judged for an action, it was being judged for intent, for responsibility, for its place within a system that demanded accountability. And here, where it becomes even more unsettling. The animal was given a defense. Yes, a defense. In some of these trials, lawyers were assigned to represent the animal, to argue on its behalf, to question the accusations, to introduce doubt. Not because people thought the animal understood the process, but because the process itself had to remain intact. Justice, in their eyes, required structure. It required fairness, even if the defendant couldn't comprehend any of it. Witnesses spoke, evidence was considered, behavior was analyzed. And eventually, a verdict was reached. Guilty. The sentence was carried out publicly, The pig was executed in a way that mirrored human punishment, sometimes dressed in clothing, sometimes displayed before the community, not just as a conclusion, but as a statement. Justice had been served. Order had been restored. But this wasn't an isolated case. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, there are records of over 100 animal trials across Europe, and that number likely underrepresents how often this actually happened. Pigs were the most common defendants, especially in cases involving harm to children, but they weren't alone. Horses were accused of violent acts. Dogs were put on trial for various offenses. And then there are the cases that push this even further into something almost surreal. Insects. Entire swarms of locusts brought before the law. Accused of destroying crops, of causing economic damage, of disrupting the balance of life in a community, and instead of simply trying to eliminate them, people brought them to court. Legal documents were written. Arguments were made. In some cases, the insects were even assigned legal representation. And when they didn't appear, because of course they didn't, the court still proceeded. Orders were issued, deadlines were given, instructions were recorded, as if these creatures could hear them, understand them, obey them. From a modern perspective, it feels absurd, almost impossible to take seriously. But at the time, it wasn't seen that way. Because these trials weren't really about the animals. They were about people. They were about what happens when something breaks the illusion of control. When a child dies unexpectedly, when crops are destroyed without warning, when something chaotic and unpredictable enters a world that depends on order to function. The legal system became a tool to reshape that chaos into something understandable. If there is a crime, there must be a criminal. If there is a criminal, there must be justice. And if justice is carried out, then the world makes sense again. Even if that sense is built on something fundamentally flawed. In many of these trials, the symbolic aspect was just as important as the legal one. Animals were sometimes dressed in human clothing during their execution, reinforcing the idea that they were being treated as members of society who had violated its rules. Public executions turned these events into spectacles. Entire communities would gather, not just to witness punishment, but to experience closure, to see with their own eyes that something had been done, that the chaos had been answered, that the system still worked. But beneath all of this, there's something deeper, something more unsettling than the trials themselves. Because these events reveal a fundamental human instinct. The need to assign blame. The need to take something that feels random and uncontrollable and reshape it into something intentional. Because accepting that tragedy can happen without reason is far more terrifying than believing that someone or something chose to cause it. And that's what these trials did. They turned instinct into decision. They turned chaos into crime. They turned animals into criminals. Over time, however, this way of thinking began to change. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, new ideas about reason, science, and human responsibility started to replace older beliefs. People began to question the foundations of their legal systems, to examine what it actually meant to be accountable for an action. And slowly, the idea of animal trials began to collapse. Because the more people understood about the natural world, the harder it became to justify treating animals as if they were capable of moral decision-making. The law evolved. The concept of intent became more precise. Responsibility became something tied to awareness, to understanding, to choice. Things animals simply don't have in the way humans do. Gradually, these trials disappeared. What was once considered justice became something else entirely. A relic, a curiosity, a disturbing reflection of a time when the line between belief and reality was far more fragile than we like to admit. But the story doesn't end there. Because even now, looking back, there's a question that lingers in a way that's difficult to ignore. If you lived in that world, would you really see it as absurd? Or would it make sense? Because when fear takes over, when something breaks the order you depend on, when something happens that you can't explain, the need for answers becomes overwhelming. And when there are no clear answers, people create them, even if they have to put a pig on trial to do it. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of this entire story. Not that animals were judged, but that for centuries, people truly believed they deserved it.